Welcome back, everybody. We don't have a textbook for this course, so a lot of the information is going to be in lecture form or it's going to be on PowerPoint slides or both. But I'm going to try to make these as interesting and as brief as I can. We're going to start with the poetry of Friedrich Schiller. So remember, this class is about the music of Beethoven, it's about the writings of Goethe, and it's about what we can tell about the history and the people of the times through their art. But we're going to start with Schiller, a different German poet, because Beethoven set his greatest piece, Ode to Joy to Music, in his Ninth Symphony, and it's a tremendous piece of music. We're going to end the course with that, and we're going to begin it with this poem. So Schiller, Friedrich Schiller, his name is spelled Schiller. The SCH in German is the same as the SH in English, so he's Schiller. And Schiller's his poet lived in Germany, or the German-speaking world, born in 1759, died I think 1805. So what does that mean? You don't need to know those dates, but you need to know what's happening in the world. And this was a world with political upheaval. We had feudalism for 1,000 years or more. And suddenly, when Schiller is in his formative stages, revolution happens. The European nation, Great Britain, had some colonies, and the biggest of those, the American colonies, revolt. And they revolt against the idea of kingship and in favor of the Republican democracy, the first modern republic or modern democracy since the age of Rome or Greece. In the Western world, there had been none. And suddenly it appears. So Schiller was 14, the Boston Tea Party, 17 of the Declaration of Independence, and closer to 28, I think, when the Constitution finally gets ratified. So his formative years, he watched this democracy being born. And then as soon as that's over, the French Revolution, that revolution didn't stick right away. We had the First Republic, only lasted a short time. I think we're in the Fifth Republic or something now. But it was still a great move to get away from the monarchy and into this democratic form of government. And so we watched the democracy happen. It was very violent, it was very bloody. And then we see the co-opting of the revolution where the little guy loses his power. And then Napoleon comes in and does a coup d'etat. I think it's around 1800, when Schiller was near the end of his life, but that coup d'etat was to reestablish democracy. Of course, Napoleon eventually declared himself emperor, and democracy was not reestablished for quite some time. But nonetheless, there was on the continent this love of democracy, and in the colonies this love of democracy. And so this is the time period Schiller grew up in. And it was also an age of the Industrial Revolution, great technology. We're going to talk about this in a future time, but there was this movement called the Enlightenment, where people decide to embrace rational thought, and they decide to embrace scientific thought and mathematical thought. And the result of that was technological breakthroughs. So the very first engine was patented while Schiller was quite young. And then Eli Wall, the cotton gin, I'll just leave it there. The cotton gin, this famous invention that changed America forever, that patent comes out in Schiller's lifetime. And so we see this explosion of technology. That explosion of technology really changed how people lived. Clothing could be mass produced, so you didn't have to have a tailor or make it yourself and weave your own fabrics. You could actually buy these things. The world changed. It changed from agricultural to industrial and mercantile almost overnight. It was also an age of exploration. You would think exploration was done. The early explorers, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, all of that stuff. But actually, during Schiller's lifetime is when what's now Mission Dolores, one of the first of the great missions, were built in California, in San Francisco. This is Europeans who came through Mexico into California. California was only being settled by Europeans during Schiller's lifetime. And the Hawaiian Islands had not been seen by Europeans until Captain Cook landed on those islands, again in Schiller's lifetime. So an age of expansion, and an age of industrial revolution, and an age of political upheaval and democracy. Schiller gets born into this world. And he's born into what's called the Holy Roman Empire. And I've got some slides on this for you to look at. But the Holy Roman Empire is kind of odd. About 1,000 years ago, a little more than that, and before there was an English language. If you can imagine, no one spoke English. There was no English language. Really, before there was, in England, before there were kings and queens on the throne, there were small little kingdoms, these Celtic kingdoms that were fighting. But the Normans hadn't come yet and established the line of succession that became Henry VIII and all those guys that we study. No kings on the English throne. This is a very long time ago. An empire was formed called the Second Holy Roman Empire. It was called Holy Roman Empire because in those days there was only one church in Europe. That was the church that we now call the Catholic Church, and the head of the church was in Rome, the Pope, and he blessed the head of the Roman Empire. So it was holy. It was blessed by the Pope, who was in Rome. So it was a Roman Empire, and it was a true empire. Well, that was in 900, 1000 AD. But we get to the time when Schiller was alive, the empire is disintegrating. And so it's gotten smaller, but it's also broken up into these independent countries. They still own allegiance to the empire, but they really function independently. So there's a bunch of little countries. It's not really an empire at all. To call it holy is odd because this is during the Reformation. So there are Catholic towns and there are Protestant towns. And there's also towns that were really very secular. And they all came together. So even though there was still a blessing from the Pope, this empire was really not a religious empire, and it really wasn't an empire. It was a confederation of states. And it wasn't in Rome. Whenever the family that was in charge of the empire changed, they would change their capital. Right now the capital is Vienna, Austria, German-speaking world. So we're in this world of this collapsing empire with lots of little principalities, and there's this big problem. The head of the empire has the title of King of the Germans, Holy Roman Emperor, King of the Germans. This was the only king in Germany. There were kings elsewhere, but king was in Germany. Well, there's another German country, part of the empire, and this is called Prussia. And originally that guy was just a prince, but he wanted to be a king, very powerful nation. And so first he's called the king in Prussia, but eventually he gets the title King of Prussia, and Prussia is a German-speaking nation. Now there are two kings of Germany. So they are battling each other. Now, and by the way, this eventually becomes all-out war. At this time, it's not a war. There's small wars. There's conflict for control of Europe. So this is kind of an interesting thing. Two Germanys and two paths, because you have a feudal world. Now, what's feudalism? Feudalism is when you've got these kings and queens and dukes and duchesses and all that, and they own everything, which means they own the land, because that's all that mattered. And then there's a peasantry that farms that land. And a lot of these guys were really slaves in a sense. They couldn't leave the land. They were bound to the land. They had some independence, but they were bound to the land, and then they had to give a certain percentage of everything they grew to the Lord. So the Lord got rich, and these people got poor. In fact, they starved. And so you had this is feudalism. But feudalism breaks down with the Industrial Revolution. What happens? Well, a lot of people go to the cities to work in factories, to own factories, to be craftspeople. They're no longer bound to the land. So you have a poor class that's free, truly free. And then you also have a bunch of rich people who own factories or ships, and they're trading with China, and they're very rich, but they have no titles. So you have a power group that is not royalty, not titled, and you have a poor group that's not bound to the land, and that changes everything. So you have a lot of choices which way you can go. Feudalism is going to collapse. America and eventually France went for democracy. And so did England. They kept this king and queen. But over time, the king and queen got less and less powerful, and the parliament got more and more until it's really a republic with a king or queen sitting above it. A lot of democracy happened. And a lot of democracy happened really about the time of Schiller's life. A real push for it. But there was another move which brought greater totalitarianism. So in Prussia, they eventually get the Kaiser. Kaiser is a word for king, but really Caesar or emperor. And after that, after a brief attempt at democracy, it becomes Nazism. Italy tries fascism under Mussolini. Spain tries fascism under Franco. In Russia, they went to a communist system, but they went to a totalitarian version of it, where even under Lenin it was quite harsh, but by the time with Stalin, it was one of the harshest dictatorships. So you have a population where this old system is going away after 1,000 years, and some people go to democracy, and some people go to totalitarianism, and we're going to try to look at the roots of why that happened. Who wanted what? Why did it happen? What are the attitudes? And that's why we're starting with this poem of Schiller. So Schiller writes a poem. He calls it the Ode to Joy. Now let me tell you about Schiller. Schiller started at the beginning of his life, he wanted to be a minister. So he was going to do Bible study. He did some Bible study. But then he changed and got a doctor degree. It's not an MD back then, but he was a doctor. He was a practicing doctor, regimental doctor. And he didn't enjoy that much, but he had great skill as a writer. So he becomes a playwright, a poet, and a philosopher. So he's doctor, minister, playwright. He does the whole thing. And so Schiller eventually becomes part of the nobility, but he's not born that way. They knight him, basically. They give him a title. And so he eventually becomes Friedrich von Schiller instead of just Friedrich Schiller. But he's born in this middle class, and he has this love of democracy, we believe. And so he writes a poem called Ode to Joy. It's actually An die Freude, which means to joy. Um, and it's a strange poem because why would you write a whole thing about joy? Of course, joy is good. Well, the belief is that he was not writing about joy. The word for joy in German is Freude. He was writing about freedom. The word in German for freedom is Freiheit. Freude, Freiheit. Both begin the same sounds, both have two syllables, kind of interchangeable. But he didn't want to call it to freedom because he was in a monarchy. He was in an empire. If he was calling for revolution, he could be in big trouble. Now, what's interesting is that he writes this poem to joy, and I think people understood it might have been, so scholars today said they understood it was to freedom, but we don't know that. But the poem becomes instantly popular, and instantly popular among the dukes and kings and queens. It turns out that a lot of the people in power in the Holy Roman Empire actually wanted democracy too. They actually believed that people should be somehow fundamentally equal. They just didn't want to die in a revolution to get there. And so Schiller writes this poem, becomes hugely popular. Beethoven's a kid when he reads it. He tries to do a setting of it then. His dream is to set this great poem, and finally in his last and greatest symphony, he does many years later. But this is one of Schiller's huge marks on the world, this poem, The Ode to Joy. Schiller dies relatively young, 45 years old. I actually think that's probably life expectancy at that time. This is before antibiotics. But with infant mortality rate of 50%, you'd think if you got to 40, you had a good chance of going beyond. But he got tuberculosis, as they called it then, consumption. And this really great writer and artist dies. But we're going to deal with the living Schiller. So what I'd like you to do is read this poem, read it all, read it as if the word joy might mean freedom, might. Look at the fact that there's religious imagery and he was originally going to be a minister. But does he mean that, or is he using that to get to something else? There's political imagery, there's social imagery, there's just beauty, there's classical imagery from ancient Greek mythology. And then pick a stanza or chorus to talk about in your discussion group. But look and see what other people have done, because I'd like everyone to pick a different one if you can. You may not be able to. And then after you've discussed yours at some length, the instructions are on Canvas, then comment on two other people's. Remember, our comments are always respectful, but we are allowed to disagree. It won't hurt their grade. It could help yours, but always with respect and civility. And we'll start a discussion on the Ode to Joy, and that will leap us into Beethoven's early work, one of his ballets. So I look forward to seeing you on the discussion board in just a little while.